Imagine a crime scene where the evidence wasn't hidden by a villain, but scrubbed clean by the supreme judge himself. Throughout the entire map of human history, there is a strange void that no archaeologist has ever been able to penetrate, the final resting place of Moses. But here is what's truly shocking. God didn't just hide it, he established a security protocol so intense that it triggered a legal battle between the Archangel Michael and Satan himself. Why would the evil one be so desperate to claim a dead body? Was he looking for a piece of evidence or a strategic pawn in a much larger game? Today, we are going to deconstruct the real reason behind this historical void of truth about spiritual security that you've likely never heard before. To truly grasp the weight of this mystery, we need to move beyond the physical act of a funeral and step into a heavenly courtroom. You see, the Bible often depicts Satan not just as a tempter, but as a prosecutor, the accuser of the brethren. And in the case of Moses, Satan believed he had the ultimate Exhibit A in his hands. Think about it for a moment. Moses was the lawgiver. He was the man who stood in the fire on Mount Sinai and brought down the 10 Commandments. He represented the very standard of God's holiness to the people. But at the rock of Meribah, Moses failed that standard. In a moment of human frustration, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. He claimed credit for a miracle that only God could perform. And in that instant, he became subject to the very law he had delivered. Romans 5:14 tells us something fascinating, that death reigned from Adam until Moses. Moses was the boundary line. To Satan, this wasn't just a personal failure, it was a legal loophole. He saw an opportunity to prove that even the greatest among us is ultimately a slave to sin and death. This brings us to a concept I like to call spiritual copyright. You see, after the fall in the garden, man was told, "Dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Satan, as the prince of this world, believes he holds the deed to that dust. He claims ownership over everything that falls under the curse of death. When Moses died, Satan didn't just show up to watch. He stepped forward to claim his property. His argument in that heavenly dispute was likely razor sharp. This man is a murderer who hid an Egyptian in the sand. This man is a rebel who disobeyed God at the rock. Therefore, his body, this vessel of dust, belongs to my kingdom. Satan wanted to use Moses' body as a trophy of failure, a permanent reminder that God's law leads only to a dead end. But check this out. This is where the Archangel Michael enters the picture. Jude 9 gives us a glimpse into this intense confrontation, but it's not what you might expect. Michael didn't use brute force or angelic weapons to settle the debate. He didn't even bring a slanderous accusation against the devil. Instead, he followed a divine protocol. He said, "The Lord rebuke you." Why? Because Michael knew this wasn't a street fight. It was a dispute over authority. Michael was protecting a legal precedent that while we may be made of dust, we do not belong to the one who rules the dust. By intervening, Michael was declaring that Moses was not a piece of evidence for the prosecution, but a treasure being preserved for a future purpose. It makes you think, doesn't it? If the enemy was that desperate to lay claim to Moses' body because of one mistake, how often does he try to do the same to you? How often does he point at your past failures to claim a copyright over your life? But just as Michael stood his ground, we must remember that our lives are not evidence of our failures, but evidence of a much higher plan, a plan that God was already setting in motion the moment he laid Moses to rest in that secret valley. Now that legal battle tells us the body was valuable, but it leads us to a deeper question. Why did God bury him in a secret location in the first place? You've probably heard the common theory that God wanted to prevent the Israelites from turning his grave into a shrine or an idol. And while that's likely true, I believe there is an even more profound strategy at work here. I want you to think about this from a different angle, an angle that has more to do with security protocols than simple burial. Think about the most classified information in our world today. When data is too sensitive to be handled, we don't just hide it, we de-index it. We remove it from the searchable records so that no one can find a trail back to it. I'm convinced that God performed the ultimate de-indexing on the body of Moses. You see, if Moses' burial site was known, it would have created what we might call a historical anchor. It would have tied Moses permanently to a specific patch of dirt in the land of Moab, anchoring him to the past. But God had a much larger mission in mind for this man. In God's strategic security protocol, certain figures and objects are removed from the physical timeline once their immediate role is finished. Consider the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail. Once they served their purpose, they vanished from history. They weren't lost by accident, they were redacted by the Creator. The same happened with Moses. By hiding his grave, God effectively took Moses off the grid. He moved him into a secure spiritual archive, far beyond the reach of human archaeology, and more importantly, far beyond the reach of Satan's interference. But why go to such extreme lengths to protect a legacy? This is the part that really made me stop and think. If Moses had a monument in the world, he would have been just another historical figure, a relic to be studied and visited. But by removing his physical location from the map, God preserved Moses' efficiency for a future mission. In the book of Revelation, we see two witnesses appearing near the end of the world to testify for God. And as we'll see in a moment, the miracles they perform look exactly like the ones Moses did back in Egypt. If Moses had a grave we could visit today, his return would feel like a ghost story or a reincarnation myth. But because he was de-indexed, because his story has a void where the end should be, his future appearance becomes a powerful, strategic reality. God wasn't just hiding a body from a bunch of idol worshippers. He was protecting a strategic asset for the final chapter of human history. He was making sure that when the time comes for Moses to stand again in the streets of Jerusalem, there would be no worldly strings attached to him. No shrines, no religious tourism, and no historical archives, only the raw, unpolluted authority of a man who was preserved in God's secret vault until the perfect moment. It was the ultimate act of preservation for a mission we are only just beginning to understand. But this brings us to a question that trips up a lot of people. If the Bible says it is appointed for man to die once, and Moses already died, why would God go to such extreme lengths to keep his physical body in a secret archive? Why not just create a brand new body when it's time for him to return? You see, the answer lies in a concept that is rarely discussed: the continuity of identity, or what I like to call the authentication of the witness. Think about how we use digital signatures today. When you log into a highly secure system, it's not enough to just look like the owner. You need the exact encrypted key that belongs to that specific account. In the realm of spiritual authority, your physical body, your dust, is part of that key. It carries a unique biological signature that connects your past service to your future mission. God didn't want to just reanimate Moses like a zombie or create a copy. He was performing a hardware upgrade. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul talks about how this corruptible body must put on incorruption. It's the same hardware, but upgraded to a version that can stand in the presence of God's glory. If Moses were to appear in a completely different, random body, the chain of custody for his authority would be broken. He wouldn't be the man from Sinai, he would be a replacement. Check this out. This is exactly why we see Moses appearing on the Mount of Transfiguration alongside Elijah. When Jesus was transformed in glory, he wasn't standing there with two random spirits. He was with the law and the prophets. For that moment to be authentic, for it to truly validate that Jesus was the fulfillment of everything Moses wrote, it had to be the actual Moses. The same man who held the tablets of stone needed to be the one testifying to the living stone. By preserving Moses' original body in a hidden location, God ensured that the biological link was never severed. He kept the hardware in a secure vault so that when the upgrade happened, there would be no question about identity. It's like having a unique ID that can never be forged. Satan knew this. He knew that if he could get his hands on that body, he could somehow corrupt the vessel and challenge the authenticity of Moses' future testimony. But God is the master of preservation. He understood that for Moses to return as one of the two witnesses in the end times, striking the earth with plagues and calling the world to repentance, he needed to carry the full weight of his original commission. He needed to be the same witness who confronted Pharaoh, now confronting the man of lawlessness. So when you think about the resurrection, don't just think of it as a miracle of power. Think of it as a miracle of integrity. God cares about the you that lived, struggled, and served him. He doesn't want a copy. He wants the original, upgraded for eternity. And for Moses, that meant his physical dust was so precious to the timeline of history that God himself became his undertaker, keeping the hardware safe until the day the world needs to hear the lawgiver's voice one more time. Have you ever wondered what would actually happen if we found that secret location today? Imagine if tomorrow morning, news outlets across the globe announced the discovery of the tomb of Moses. To some, it sounds like an archaeological dream, but in reality, it would likely trigger the greatest religious and political crisis of our time. You see, in the world of spiritual governance, Moses is the gold standard. If his physical body were ever found, it wouldn't just be a discovery, it would become a weapon of institutional power. Whoever controlled the tomb of the lawgiver would attempt to control the law itself. For centuries, religious systems have survived by owning divine relics to validate their own authority. If Moses had a grave we could visit, his bones would be turned into a material chain, a way for men to gatekeep access to God. But God performed a hard reset. By personally wiping every trace of that location from the map, he effectively dismantled any human attempt to institutionalize the legacy of Moses. He was performing what I call a strategic redaction. He made it impossible for us to cling to a geographic coordinate or a pile of ancient dust. This forces us into a reality that many find uncomfortable, that our faith cannot be anchored to a physical monument. It ensures that our relationship with the Creator must be found in spirit and truth, not through a pilgrimage to a tourist destination. This is exactly why Satan fought Michael for that body. His goal wasn't just to have a trophy. His goal was to turn the burial site into a magnet for idolatry. He knows that our hearts are prone to elevating the hero above the Creator, much like the Israelites did with the golden calf. If he could turn Moses' grave into a shrine, he could successfully turn our focus away from the living God and lock us in a prison of the past. He wanted to use the physical remains of the lawgiver to keep humanity looking at the cemetery of history instead of the hope of the future. The protection God provided in that secret valley wasn't just for Moses, it was for you and me. It was a strategic move to ensure that the authority of his word would never be held hostage by a physical location. By keeping the grave hidden, God was declaring that the Messiah Moses pointed toward is a living, breathing reality that doesn't need archaeological proof to be true. So as we close this study of the hidden tomb and the battle between Michael and Satan, I want to leave you with one question. What tombs are you building for your own faith today? Are you relying on physical things, rituals, buildings, or the approval of human systems to anchor your walk with God? Or are you ready to step into the freedom of a faith that doesn't need a map because it's led by the Spirit? God buried the past so that we could finally walk into the future. Let's make sure we aren't the ones trying to dig it back up.